guest speaker. Thank you. Welcome especially to our guest speaker, distinguished Professor Lesley Hughes, and other participants, and there are 81 of us at the moment. This would have been a gala occasion at Parliament House in Sydney, but of course the Strangers Dining Room, where we normally hold our function, is of course closed to all functions at the moment due to the COVID restrictions, of which we are bitterly aware. We would have been enjoying a glass of wine, and we wouldn't have been struggling with bad hair, as most of us are struggling with at the moment. It would have been our 26th annual luncheon, and we are grateful to Lesley that she was so gracious. Somebody has not pressed their mute button. Please press your mute button.
Everyone is crazy. I've never.
We are grateful to Lesley that she was so gracious, generous and accommodating, and so we were able to proceed with this Zoomed webinar function. It will be recorded, or is being recorded, and Professor Hughes has agreed to take questions if time allows at the end of her presentation. The chat function is operating throughout the webinar, and you can make your contribution as participants by raising questions if you so wish.
Yes, Sefer, this is.
Yes, it's okay, good. Otherwise, please leave the mute button on, off, mute yourselves, please. And that is a little red microphone on the left-hand side of the screen. I'd just like to say a few words about the library, and then we'll get on with the formal part of today. The library has been closed since mid-June, but we do have access to our systems, and we have now negotiated with the City of Sydney to gain some physical access to do some of our essential and urgent work. We held our AGM virtually this year and elected board members and officers, and I welcome Christine Yates and Susie Farrell as new board members. We cautiously then resumed our work with volunteers returning gradually, and we actually had one face-to-face board meeting in early June, and then all came to a screeching halt again. In this time, we have lost a dedicated supporter in Valwyn Weishart, two former board members, Marion Shaw and Diane Haig, both of whom passed away. And just 2 days ago, Shirley Jones, one of our founding members, passed away at the age of 93 at Greenwich Hospice. We will be paying her due tribute in the fullness of time. It has been a difficult year with much less achieved than our ambitious business plan had mapped out for us. We are confident, however, in our generous membership base. We hope to hold our raffle later this year with the usual array of prizes. We are, as you may know, or most of you will know, a self-funded organisation and dependent on the generosity of members and supporters and our wonderful community of volunteers. We have no staff except for that community of volunteers. Could I extend my thanks on behalf of our board to all our supporters and donors again? We share a common vision and a strong belief in the library's vital feminist mission in these times, in these very difficult times, and for all times. Now to the formal presentation from Professor Lesley Hughes, and I'd like to introduce her. From Eunice Foote to Greta Thunberg, An intriguing title, and we are grateful to Lesley for opening up this women's history. Lesley, you are the first scientist among our very distinguished speakers, and I'm considering that a very important landmark for our organisation. We've had governors and former governor generals, journalists, Indigenous women's leaders, singers, artists, all kinds of professions have been represented, but we have not had a scientist, and never mind a climate scientist. Lesley has focused on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems almost for her entire professional life. She's currently Professor of Biology and Pro-Vice-Chancellor Research, Integrity and Development at Macquarie University. She is Director of the Biodiversity Node at the Office of Environment and Heritage. She was a Commissioner of the Climate Commission until its abolition by the infamous Tony Abbott, and one of 5 Australian lead authors for the 4th report, the 4th and 5th assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Commission on Climate Change.
What else would it be?
She is an advocate for gender equality and women in STEM, and she works for gender equity and women in STEM, working also with the Athena SWAN, the Scientific Women's Academic Network program at Macquarie University. She has been recognised for her outstanding work with the Eureka Prize for promoting understanding of Australian science research, and received in 2019 the Australian Museum Research Institute Lifetime Achievement Award. I welcome Professor Hughes and hand over the session to her. Thank you, Lesley.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm humbled to be in such prestigious company of past speakers to the Jessie Street Luncheon talk. Before I begin, and I'm going to share my slides because as a scientist, I feel a bit naked without slides, but I would repeat Josepha's request that you put yourselves on mute because I am getting a lot of feedback. If you've not put yourselves on mute before, move your cursor to the bottom row, look for that little microphone and just hit that microphone and it'll go red and you'll see a slash through it. By all means, come off mute at the end, but I'd really appreciate everybody that can being on mute, and we are recording this session. All right, I'm going to share my screen now. And I'm hoping everybody can see my title slide. Josepha, please yell if you can't. So as Josepha said, I want to approach talking about climate change today, partly through the lens of several women who have made an outstanding contribution to our understanding of what's happening with the climate. So that's why I've called it From Eunice to Greta, a brief history of women saving the planet. I'm actually going to talk specifically in the first half of my talk about 12 outstanding women, and then the second half will really be about climate change because I want to talk about why the contribution of these women have been so important for us now, and especially us and our children and grandchildren into the future. So you might think it's strange that I'm actually going to start off with a picture of a man, but you'll see why in a moment. So this handsome gentleman here is John Tyndall. Until very recently, John Tyndall was given the honour of being the first person to understand how greenhouse gases heat the Earth's surface by absorbing heat from the sun. So John Tyndall was always the person given that credit. But a few years ago, we actually discovered that John Tyndall was not the first. In fact, it was a woman called Eunice Foote. She was a remarkable woman. We don't have any pictures of her, unfortunately, but she was an inventor, a writer, and a scientist, an amateur scientist. And she did an experiment, probably on her kitchen bench, that was the first experiment that quantified how much heat from the sun was trapped by different greenhouse gases. And this is one of her findings. She said the highest effects of the sun's rays I have found to be in carbonic acid gas. And carbonic acid gas is the old-fashioned name for carbon dioxide. So she actually beat John Tyndall to this finding by about 4 years. Her work was presented to the American Academy of Science, but because in those days women could not actually be members of the Academy, her paper was read to the Academy by a man. So here's a few other women that have done really incredible things for both furthering the science of climate change and also bringing it to public attention. Sharon Burrow, an Australian, of course, former head of our ACTU, then became the head of the International Trade Union of Confederates. And it's her line that there are no jobs on a dead planet that has resonated ever since. Some of these other women you probably won't have heard of, but they're personal heroes of mine, heroines, I should say. Corinne Leclerc is one of the scientists credited with, sorry, if you could go on mute, that would be great. She's credited with providing the background science that we now understand about the carbon cycle and what the relationship of the carbon cycle to climate change. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Naomi Oreskes, I'm sure some of you have actually read Naomi Oreskes' book called Merchants of Doubt. It's a really outstanding exploration of how a handful of, unfortunately, scientists in this case, that worked for tobacco companies and then for large fossil fuel interests, managed to, through over several decades, obscure the truth on the relationship of things like smoking and lung cancer and fossil fuel burning and climate change. And she called her book Merchants of Doubt, and it's been very, very influential as an expose of how those groups of people have been operating. Connie Hedegaard. Connie Hedegaard was a Danish politician who was extremely influential in getting the 2009 meeting in Copenhagen that really set the scene for the later Paris Climate Agreement. She is now the head of the EU Commission on Climate. This picture here is a picture of the final beating of the gavel in Paris in 2015, when the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed to by all of the countries that are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I want to identify these two extremely influential women and their role in that really important international framework. Christiana Figueres was at the time the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She stayed in that position until 2016. She is still extremely active in climate science and climate action. Probably less well known is this lady, but incredibly important. Laurence Toubiana was the chief French negotiator for the Paris Climate Agreement. She stayed very much in the background, but her contribution can simply not be understated. She then went on to become the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Moving to Australia now, and to some younger people, and two people who I count very proudly as great friends of mine. And every time somebody says to me, what can I do? I'm just one person. I use these two women as examples of what individuals can actually do. Firstly, Anna Rose. Anna Rose and Amanda Mackenzie, who I'll speak about in a moment, started together an organisation called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. It started in 2006 and now has over 120,000 young people as members. Anna went on from that to run Earth Hour for many years for WWF. She was one of the founders of Farmers for Climate Action, and she is now one of the founders of the Groundswell Foundation, which raises money for climate action. She's an extraordinary person. And then my very good friend and colleague, Amanda Mackenzie, began her climate journey with Anna for starting the AYCC. She later became the Chief Communications Director for the Climate Commission when I was on the Commission. Then when the Commission was abolished by Tony Abbott, as Josepha mentioned at the beginning, Amanda and a group of us commissioners and Tim Flannery started the Climate Council. The Climate Council is now nearly 8 years old and continues to go from strength to strength. And I can honestly say that without Amanda Mackenzie, we would absolutely not be in the position of strength that we are today. She is an extraordinary person. Annika Molesworth. Annika is a farmer, and she's been one of the public voices for the impacts of climate change on Australian agriculture in particular. She's a founding director of Farmers for Climate.
Reading that later today. I've got council tonight.
Could I just ask Lynn Saville to go on mute? Thank you. And she's a former Australian Farmer of the Year. Another quiet achiever who's done a tremendous amount for raising the profile of climate change in Australia, particularly in the farming community. Now, of course, you've all heard of this young woman, Greta Thunberg. Greta started out as a 15-year-old schoolgirl sitting outside the Swedish Parliament on Friday afternoon with this little handmade sign, and she just sat there. She didn't protest. Well, it was a form of protest, but she felt so deeply about the climate issue that she felt she had to do something. She didn't know what she could do, so she decided, with the support of her parents, to simply go and sit outside the Swedish Parliament every Friday afternoon. The rest is history, of course, because Greta has gone on to address the UN, to address the Davos Economic Forum, and started a whole movement of young people who are concerned about climate change. And one of those protests and marches is shown there on the bottom. I think she is really one of the most remarkable people in the world, woman or not. Closer to home, however, one of the people that Greta Thunberg inspired was this young woman, Daisy Jeffrey, in Sydney. Daisy only finished her HSC last year. She's a cellist. She was at the Conservatorium High School, and she was one of the main organisers for the school kids strikes here in Australia. And that picture there is actually Daisy addressing that extraordinary grouping of people. I was in that crowd somewhere in Hyde Park a couple of years ago for one of the first big school kids strikes. She is an extraordinary young person. So that's just a brief run through of 12 women that I hold in enormous regard for their contributions to climate action. But now I want to talk about why I think the work on climate action that those women embody is just so important. I'm going to show you a little animation now. It's got on this little page, you can see all the countries in the world. They're arrayed in alphabetical order. So Australia is about halfway along that top row. As the animation runs through, what you will see is from 1900 to 2018, each year, and whether it was cooler than average or warmer than average. The cool years will be in blue, the warmer years will be in orange and red. It will run through with real data to 2018, and then I'll show you projected data going out to the end of this century on what we call a mid-range emissions scenario. So not the most conservative, not the most pessimistic scenario. It will show what is likely to happen over this century. If you'll excuse the pun, it will take a few seconds to warm up, but then it'll be pretty obvious what's going on. So I'll hit the button and off it goes. So that's the data. And now this is the projected data going through, showing what is likely to happen under a mid-range emissions scenario to the end of this century. And really the moral of this story is that it doesn't really matter whereabouts you are in the world. Under a scenario like that, it's going to get very, very hot everywhere. Now, I'm sure most of you will be aware that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its latest report about 3 weeks ago. The tagline of this report is that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what was in this report. So firstly, we know that the oceans are absorbing more than 90% of the extra heat in the Earth's system, and we can now detect warming down to a depth of about 2 kilometres. The oceans are also absorbing a lot of that extra CO2 in the atmosphere. That is changing the composition of seawater, making it more acidic. And now the oceans are about 30% more acidic than they were in pre-industrial times. As a result, partly of that heat that's being absorbed by the oceans, we're seeing more underwater heat waves, and that is leading to coral bleaching. And we've had 3 major bleaching events in the last 6 years on the Great Barrier Reef, as an example, with about 50% of the coral being lost. As it warms up, glaciers are melting and retreating. This will continue to happen for decades. This shows pictures of the Muir Glacier in Alaska between 1941 and 2004. Many of the major glaciers around the world have just about disappeared. In the Antarctic and the Arctic, ice is also melting very rapidly, and the rate of ice sheet loss has increased by about 4-fold over the last decade compared to just back in the 1990s. As a result of all of that warming of the ocean and of the extra fresh water going into the ocean, sea level rise is ongoing and accelerating, with the rate of global sea level rise having doubled in the past decade compared to the average of the previous 4 decades. We are also getting stronger storms, stronger tropical cyclones in the southern hemisphere, stronger hurricanes in the northern hemisphere, and there's now serious consideration to come up with a category 6 to capture the severity of some of the cyclones that we are starting to see. The water cycle throughout the world is said to be intensifying, and what that means is that in dry areas they're getting drier with longer, hotter and more severe droughts. In wet areas are tending to get wetter. Wherever rainfall falls, because of the extra energy being held in the atmosphere, it's tending to come down in heavier bursts, more intense bursts, and that is leading in many parts of the world to increased flooding. Extreme heat and heat waves are increasing. So globally, 2020 was the hottest year on record, with the last 7 years being the hottest 7 on record. And people die in heat waves. Here's a couple of examples which will probably shock you as it shocked me. In 2003, a 3-week-long heat wave in Europe killed 70,000 people. In Russia in 2010, a severe heat wave killed 56,000 people. Here in Australia we know has already warmed over 1.4 degrees since records began in 1910. Our hottest year on record was 2019, and during that year there were 3 times the number of extreme hot days as any year last century. And poor old Penrith in Western Sydney had the distinction in January 2020 of being the hottest place on earth at nearly 49 degrees. As we're all painfully aware here, bushfire seasons are lengthening and becoming more severe. In some parts of Australia, bushfire seasons are now at least 2 months longer than they were even a decade ago. The Black Summer bushfires, which is actually a misnomer because these bushfires actually started in the winter of 2019. They burnt all the way through to January 2020, burning 18 million hectares. And just for comparison, that's about 3 times the size of Tasmania. The impacts of those bushfires were extraordinary. More than 3 billion animals killed or displaced, more than 3,000 homes lost. The overall costs have approached $100 billion, making this the most expensive climate-related disaster in Australia's history. The health impacts were extraordinary. There were 33 people that were directly killed in the fires, but another 400 lost their lives over the weeks following, mainly as a result of smoke inhalation. And there were more than 4,000 more hospital admissions than at that time of the year usually. 8 million people in Australia were badly affected by smoke. One of the things that happened during those bushfires is that the fires burnt into areas that, like rainforest, never been burnt before. Ecosystems all over Australia and the world are transforming. But climate change is not just an environmental issue as it's often portrayed. It's very much a human issue, an economic issue, a community and security issue. Oxfam has, in their latest report at the end of 2019, estimated that 20 million people are now displaced by extreme weather every single year. And that blue line there shows that increase in weather-related displacements of people throughout the world. So unfortunately, we're set for more of the same. Things will get worse before they get better. The greenhouse gases that we've already put into the atmosphere lock us into more warming, even if we were able to stop emissions today. At least another 0.2 to 0.6 of a degree of warming is already locked into the system. And what that means is that we will probably go over that 1.5 degree target sometime in the early 2030s, possibly before. And this means, of course, more of the same. So the IPCC report tells us that we should expect more heat waves, increased fire risk, more marine heat waves, greater ocean acidity, more coral bleaching, more intensification of things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon in Australia that brings droughts and floods. We will continue to accelerate sea level rise. Sea levels in Australia are warming faster than the global average, with more regions affected by drought. And it's still going to get very, very hot indeed, with the average number of days, for example, over 35 degrees in Western Sydney, potentially increasing 5-fold by the end of the century, with 50-degree days in places like Sydney and Melbourne probably becoming relatively commonplace by 2050. There was some really interesting research published recently indicating that Australians are actually 3 times more worried about climate change than they are about COVID. So we do all worry about the mental health problems that COVID is bringing, but climate change is also an issue for mental health. So now I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do about all of this. So the Paris Climate Agreement, which is an incredibly important international agreement, aims to keep global temperatures to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an aspiration to keep them below 1.5 degrees. As I've indicated, the 1.5 degree target is probably already going to be exceeded. Unfortunately, the pledges of countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement thus far, if you add them all together and they're all implemented 100% and on time, still give us warming probably up to about 3 degrees. Now, if you consider that we have already warmed 1.2 degrees globally, it's hard to imagine what a 3-degree world could be like. So how much time have we got? That's the really huge question. And we can work out how much time we've got to get things under control using this thing called the carbon budget. And the carbon budget is a little formula that relies on the fact that we understand very well how much the world warms up based on how much carbon we put into the atmosphere. So based on this reasoning, we can ask questions like this: will we meet the 1.5 degree target? Now, currently, we are putting about 11.5 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. At this rate, the carbon budget that we can afford to spend for 1.5 degrees will be fully spent in 2.5 years from now. That is, we'll have put all that carbon into the atmosphere 2.5 years from now that will get us to 1.5. To meet this target, or at least to stay below this target, we need to multiply our global Paris pledges 5-fold and successfully implement them. So we can ask the same question: will we meet the well below 2 degrees target, using the same reasoning? And at this rate, the carbon budget will be fully spent by about 2030, so about 9.5 years from now. So to meet this target, we will need to multiply our Paris pledges about 3-fold. The formula also tells us that to stay well below 2 degrees of warming, we have to halve our emissions by 2030. We actually have to be at net zero by 2040 at the latest. And because we've waited so long to get emissions under control, we now know that 2050 is too late. You'll be hearing a lot about net zero by 2050. It's a decade too late to stay below 2 degrees. And this is the thing: the longer we wait, the harder it gets. You can think of emissions like a mountain that is a living thing, it's growing. We've got to get to the top of that mountain and then start to come down the other side. And the longer we wait to get to the top, the taller the mountain becomes and the greater our challenge. This is Antonio Guterres. He's responsible for saying that the last IPCC report was code red for humanity. He just recently said a target of net zero 2050 emissions to address the climate emergency is an illusion. Net zero must be achieved in the next decade. There must be no new coal plants built after 2021. The OECD countries must phase out existing coal by 2030, with all others following suit by 2040. They're pretty tough words. And of course, it's particularly tough for Australia. We know that to stay below 2 degrees, we have to leave 90% of global coal reserves in the ground unburnt. Australia is the world's largest exporter of coal, 29% of global trade. We're the second largest exporter of thermal coal, which is the coal that we use to generate electricity. And if we add in the amount of gas we export, we are the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in total. We are a big part of the problem. Added to this, the Australian government currently spends, at least last year, $10.3 billion of our taxpayers' money subsidising the fossil fuel industry. Now, the UN puts out every year a report called the Sustainable Development Goals Report, where they look at every country in the world and how well they're meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17. In the last report, overall, Australia ranked 35 out of 165, not at the top, but not at the bottom. Unfortunately, however, in terms of climate, goal number 13 is climate action and climate policy, and you can see where Australia ranks there. In fact, the UN ranked Australia last out of more than 200 countries that they looked at for climate action and climate policy. In the previous report, we'd been ranked as second last, just ahead of Brunei, but in the last report, we are ranked last. A report that we put out with the Climate Council earlier this year in March called Aim High, Go Fast, and I would commend that report to you if you're really interested in this area, did a calculation about what Australia's fair share of global climate action should be in terms of emissions reduction. And we calculated that Australia actually has to triple its current emissions target to 75% of reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Our current target that the government took to Paris was for a 26 to 28% reduction. So we think this needs to be tripled. Australia needs to reach net zero by 2035 to do its fair share. So now we're all looking forward to November in Glasgow in Scotland for at the next big UN meeting, COP26. At this meeting, the signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement are expected and certainly strongly encouraged to increase their level of emissions reduction ambition. At the moment, the Australian government has indicated no change to the target, but it is expected that the Prime Minister will take a net zero by 2050 ambition to that meeting. But as I just said, net zero by 2050 is actually a decade at least too late. Fortunately for us and for the world, some of the other countries around the world are becoming a great deal more ambitious. So these are some of the emissions reduction pledges that are expected at the Glasgow meeting for 2030. So the EU is pledging 55% reduction, the US under Joe Biden a 50% reduction, the UK a whopping 68% reduction, with Canada at 40 to 45% and Japan at 46%. And one of the things that the IPCC report reiterated, it was a pretty depressing read overall, but it did have this little glimmer of hope. The benefits of stronger action will be realised within our lifetimes. That is, if we can make really strong, really deep emissions reductions in 20 to 30 years from now, so within most of our lifetimes, we could expect at least a levelling off of global temperatures and then coming down and moving towards a safer climate for our children and grandchildren. So my final mantra and takeaway messages: we are in a climate emergency. It is not just a slogan, it is a fact. We are seeing the physical and biological world around us transforming before our very eyes. And we don't have much time to get it under control. The window for action to move to a safe operating space for humanity is closing. And what this means is that every fraction of a degree matters. Every fraction of a degree of more warming is doing us more harm. Every further fraction will do us more harm. So that means that every year of delay really matters. and every choice that we make matters. We have climate change with us because of billions and billions of choices, and we now have to make much better choices. And I want to leave you with my favourite poster from the climate marches that happened before the Paris climate meeting in 2015, because I think it puts the onus on all of us. This is not just leaving it to other people to make a difference. We are all the ones that we've been waiting for. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and be very happy to answer any questions that I can. Back to you, Josepha.
Thank you, Lesley. I'm going to moderate the questions, but I might start off with one now. Lesley, the issue of population growth has been raised by some commentators. Chief among them, of course, in Australia is Bob Carr, who has relentlessly pursued this issue. To what extent does population growth contribute to the problem, and what might we do ourselves about it?
Well, look, because human activity is causing the climate to change, obviously how many humans there are on the planet has an impact on that. But people that raise the population growth argument don't usually have a palatable solution to it. You know, we all saw what happened in China with the one-child policy. What is actually much more important than population growth is actually what each human does. If you look at a graph, and I haven't got one here right now, but if you look at a graph between emissions and wealth, it's a very, very strong very strong linear relationship. That is, richer countries tend to emit more regardless of their population, and poorer countries emit less regardless of their population. And in fact, some of the countries with the largest populations in the world that are developing nations and are poor emit far, far, far less than some of the less populous rich countries. So it's not so much the number of people that's important. It has an impact, obviously, but it's how those people live that's important. And our challenge really is in lifting other countries out of poverty, is to help them do that in a way where they don't make all the same fossil fuel mistakes and unsustainable growth mistakes that the developed world has made. So I think, you know, a lot of people like to put up the population growth argument. Very few of them have a solution, but it's really how you live, which is more important than how many of us there are.
Thank you. I'm now very happy to open it up to everybody. So those of you who would like to ask a question, if you could unmute your button, and Lesley will be able to respond. We don't have anything in the chat except for complaints about the background noise. So are there any questions that people would like to ask?
There's a couple of people, Josepha, with their hands raised. Can you see those?
Yes, I can't see them, Lesley. I haven't got a full screen. Oh yes, Lynn Eggins.
Yes, look, my biggest concern is our Prime Minister. I mean, he's absolutely, unbelievably recalcitrant. And what can we do about him? What can we do about him? He doesn't, you know, I've written letters. Many people I know have written letters. We've struggled so hard to make the man make any changes, and he thinks he just goes on with his salami little smile. And you know, it's unbelievable. I know he's not the only one that's at fault, but really he seems to be, I don't think he's intent on making any changes. It's hard to know, to think.
Vote him out.
Yeah, well.
I mean,
but
Lynn, I certainly agree with you. And the only thing that politicians will listen to is getting voted out. I think coming up to this next election is going to be really, really an interesting one federally, because there are now at least 30 seats around Australia where there is a Voices for a group that are targeting, that are supporting progressive independents that are mostly standing at least partially on a climate action platform. Many of you will be living in those seats. So seats like Bradfield in Sydney, Wentworth, other seats like that are hoping to emulate what happened in Warringah with Zali Steggall and in Indi with Cathy McGowan and Helen Haynes, with progressive independent candidates that are putting forward climate action as one of their main platforms. So if any of you are, you know, the best thing we can do, the single best thing we can do is make climate action our number one voting priority in any election. And let's hope that that works.
Josefa, it's Carolyn. I just want to ask a question. I just want to thank Lesley for her superb presentation. That's fantastic. And that's why I don't have any questions. You've presented. So thank you very much.
I think Linda Christian was asking a question. Linda?
Yeah, hello, Josefa. How are you? It's Linda from WAG here, WAG at Lanco. I think you might know me. Yeah, it's along the political lines as well. There's got to be a way to stop the Liberal Party in particular being financed by the coal and the fossil fuel lobbies before anything meaningful will happen. With the Liberal Party, while they're being funded by those people, they are not going to do anything much meaningful because that's where they get their money from. It's all down to the money. And what's happening now, which is a little bit more hopeful, is that industry is stepping in and going round the sides of a very recalcitrant government and doing things. Twiggy Forrest is being very proactive in that space. Also, interestingly, I want to note that the federal government actually has done something towards they've projected building wind farms, big ones, out to sea off the coast of Queensland. One hopes they don't build it right in the middle of the Barrier Reef, but who knows? And further down the east coast, they're positing building 4 large wind farms. So I put that in as well. But the problem with our government is that they are funded by the fossil fuel lobby, and those people walk the corridors of power, and they can see ministers whenever they like. Yeah, so it's a comment and a query and a sort of a despairing shake of the head.
Well, don't despair. Yes, look, you're right. I think the fossil fuel lobby continues to have enormous influence, especially with the coalition. But, you know, Labor has not necessarily covered itself in glory either. They're trying to very much walk a fine line between they want more climate action, but they also don't want to be seen to not be supporting coal mining communities. So they're tying themselves in knots.
Oh, that's the other thing, that they have to. There's got to be another way of approaching this too. That you've got to replace the coal jobs with other jobs. There's got to be renewable jobs to replace the coal jobs, and then there won't be so much pushback from Queensland, which is where the election was lost last time. So we need renewable jobs up there, don't we, really?
There are renewable jobs up there, and as I said, the answer will be to vote them out. Thanks to
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. Kereth Power. Kereth, unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really, really inspiring. I wanted to ask, because for most of my life I've been involved in direct environmental actions. For instance, I stood in front of bulldozers at Terania Creek, and I have been pushed over by a policeman at the march in 2020. And I just wanted to know, I'm currently involved in a replanting group in the riverbank at Penrith, one of the recipients of Australia's hottest or the world's hottest day a couple of years ago. I'm just wondering how much the kind of direct action, being in land care, planting trees, protesting, has. I mean, I'm I'm just not in a position to influence large policy at all, except through my vote. But I have chosen to involve myself in tree planting and protests for most of my adult life. How much effect, as you said, you know, people say one person can't do very much. How much effect does that action have on the outcomes of the policy making?
Well, look, it's very, Kerith, good for you for all of that work. It's very difficult to quantify it, of course, but if none of us did anything, then we'd be really screwed, to be honest. So I think one of the things you can do, which you've already done, which is join a group for collective action. And one of the things I often tell people who say, well, I feel so helpless as an individual. And I say, well, don't be an individual, find a group of like-minded people. And there are certainly many, many climate action groups around the place, as there are environmental groups, and join up, because collective action is more powerful than individual action. So keep planting your trees. I mean, planting trees is still the best way we have of drawing down the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. You know, that we do have technologies to do that, but so far they're not scalable to a sufficient extent to make much of a difference. So planting more trees and looking after our biodiversity, giving it the best possible chance to be resilient to the impacts of climate change is still enormously important. So, you know, keep doing that, but use your vote as well.
Thanks, Kerith. Mandy Nolan, you've got your hand up. Mandy, if you would unmute yourself.
That's
Good,
okay. Thanks, Joseph. I just unmuted myself. Sorry, it's a bit hard to unmute myself sometimes. I just wanted to say too, I'm actually here from northern New South Wales and Mullumbimby. I'm the Greens candidate for this region. We're the third most likely seat to be won by the Greens in Australia in the lower house. The reason that I did stand for this seat is because of the power in the lower house on the crossbench to make changes, particularly to climate change. You know, particularly if a Labor government gets voted in against coal and gas. But I wonder, and what I often see that we're not engaging as well in the conversation, is how do we engage First Nation voices in the climate change conversation, particularly in Australia, to get, you know, climate justice and First Nation justice working hand in hand.
Well, look, thanks, Mandy, and good luck in the election. I certainly think if the balance of power is held by the Greens and a handful of progressive independents, we will see some really, really outstanding action. Look, there are a number of First Nation groups now working towards climate action. One for young people is called SEED, and they're very active. So I would look into those. We're certainly, most climate action groups have a very specific outreach programs to involve Indigenous people in their groups. I'll give you one example. So one of the other hats I wear is, as a director, I'm on the board of WWF. And we're just about to, hopefully, we've just appointed our first Indigenous director, and we're hoping to appoint 10 to 12 new Indigenous governors in the next year. So look, I think certainly the Climate Council, for whom I'm a councillor, is doing some work with Indigenous groups, and I think most environmental and climate action groups are very much looking to involve Indigenous peoples, but there are some specific groups like SEED.
Thanks.
Further questions? I can't see them on the screen here.
Anne Barber has got her.
Anne Barber. Hello, Anne. Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm not used to speaking this way. Thanks for the presentation. I thought it was brilliant. My only suggestion / comment is that people can lean on their superannuation companies, if you're lucky enough to have superannuation, and change all your investments to ethical investments. Move them away from coal and gas and gambling and all the other socially detrimental organisations, because money speaks. Money speaks, and that's why we're having so many problems with the Liberal. They all think we're emotional and climate change will go away. Whereas if you talk jobs and money, I think they will listen more. But thank you.
Yes, thanks, Anne. And I'll get to Michelle in a minute. I can see your hand up, don't worry. And look, yes, it's a great suggestion. Money does speak, and there is an organisation for those of you that are interested in getting more information as to whether your bank or insurance company or superannuation company is investing in fossil fuels. I would suggest you visit the Market Forces website. Market Forces is a fantastic organisation that is working to help people and companies to divest from fossil fuel assets. There are a number of banks that do not invest in fossil fuels. I've switched my savings account to one of those banks. And there are some new, relatively new superannuation companies as well, like Future Super, that do not invest. But if you're interested in finding out whether your companies invest in fossil fuels and the extent of that, I suggest you have a look at the Market Forces website. It's very easy to use. So yes, it's a great suggestion. It's also the case that I think business is really moving very rapidly now. They're way ahead of the government. Big business understands that they've got both climate risks, and they also understand that their customers and clients and employees are demanding more action. So I think the business community is really moving much, much faster than the government. Michelle, you've had your hand up for a while.
Unmute. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Right. I was just going to point out that this morning in the Sydney Morning Herald, it announced that the Murdoch press has decided not to stand in the editorial, not to consistently stand for the fossil fuel lobby, but to actually consider that there's another way of doing things.
Yes, indeed. I saw that as well this morning. It's a very interesting move, not before time, of course. There's also quite a lot of commentary around today of people being rather cynical about that. So it's one thing to announce that it's going to happen. And I do, you know, I think it is a good sign, you know, better late than never. Let's actually see what difference that makes, but it's got to be a move in the right direction. So yeah, really interesting article in the Herald this morning. But if you Google that, you'll also find some interesting and somewhat more skeptical commentary about it. So let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Let's face it.
Lesley, a question from Helen Greer. What part could landscape regeneration play in drawing down carbon from the atmosphere?
Yes, well, I mean, soil and vegetation stores a lot of carbon, and one of the reasons that we've got such a greenhouse gas problem is that so much of our native vegetation has been cleared, and the carbon that would have been stored in that vegetation or in the soil underneath has gone into the atmosphere. So looking after the land, promoting regenerative agriculture, promoting sequestration of carbon in soils and in vegetation is part of the solutions. It's not the only solution, because we've got to stop the carbon going into the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning in the first place. But we still, as I said before, growing trees is still the best way we know of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So, yep, we've got to absolutely look after our land better.
Another question from me, in reading the policymakers' summary report from the IPCC, they do talk about methane.
Yep.
Now, how big is methane as a contributor, and where should our action be in reducing that as individuals, I guess?
A really good question, Zephyr. I think one of the things that struck me most about the IPCC report was the methane issue. So there is a graph in the report that shows that methane is now 2/3 of the problem that CO2 is. So if you think of CO2 as being a problem, methane is 2/3 of that problem added on. So methane continues to go up very rapidly. Methane is actually a far more effective greenhouse gas than CO2, molecule for molecule. It traps more heat. It's just fortunate that you measure methane in parts per billion, not parts per million, like we do with CO2. Methane going into the atmosphere is coming from a lot of different sources. One of that is agriculture. So sheep and cattle belch methane. So cutting down on the livestock population of the world will help. So if we all move to a much more plant-based diet and ate a lot less beef and lamb, that would help a lot, in fact. It also comes out from growing rice in rice paddies and that sort of thing. So that's a bit of a harder problem to deal with. But one of the most fast-growing sources of methane going into the atmosphere is from gas fracking. So natural gas is methane, pretty much pure methane. As we frack and mine that gas, some of it escapes. It's called fugitive emissions, and that's putting pretty much pure methane into the atmosphere. With the gas that's actually captured and then burnt, well, that gets converted into CO2, and so that's a problem as well. So this idea that we should have in Australia a gas-led recovery because gas is somehow a cleaner fuel is an absolute furphy. Gas is a fossil fuel, and if you add the emissions from fugitive methane emissions into the mix, gas is pretty much as bad as coal.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Well, there've been a number of thank yous in the chat as people have had to go, Lesley. So I'm going to ask Suzanne Marks, Vice Chair of the Board, to present the thanks. Suzanne, are you there?
Yes, I've just unmuted. Can you hear me? Thank you.
Over to you then.
Okay. Well, Lesley, I'm still my mindset is still so much in the sound of your voice in your presentation that I haven't come out of it yet. So I'm going to move to saying thank you to you. And on behalf of the Jessie Street National Women's Library Board, our members, our supporters, and the visitors here today, thank you, Lesley. Your speech or your address is inspiring, and it tells the riveting story of the women who have been over the last 150 years, plus if we include Eunice, who have brought to light the critical, you've brought to light the critical roles of these women, the scientists, the organisational leaders and the activists, and the role they've played over the decades in advancing our understanding of global warming, climate change, and the part that humans have played in it. We also thank you for your leadership and activism in urging national and global leaders through your solid evidence-based arguments to act now. I'm sure everyone here today supports you in your ongoing work so critical to the survival of present and future generations and to all other life forms with which we share this beautiful planet Earth and which we all love so much. Again, Lesley, on behalf of us all, thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It was a pleasure.
And could I now invite Kate Beringer to thank the organisers, please?
Hello.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Giuseppa. The Annual Luncheon Committee thanks distinguished Professor Lesley Hughes for agreeing to be part of our somewhat different annual luncheon for this year, our COVID luncheon, something a path we've never been down before. And thank you for all the participants who supported this presentation as well. I'd also, as convener of the Annual Luncheon Committee, really I'm so fortunate to have a wonderful group of women working on the committee tirelessly. It's been going on for 25 years now, 26 years, and there's a lot of work behind the scenes. First of all, we were very geared up to go to luncheon this year, publicity, letters written. We pulled the pin on that one, but here we are at a webinar, and I thank them for their work in getting that going, and also still working in the background, getting our raffle organised for later in the year. So we hope to welcome you to Parliament House and Strangers Dining Room next year for our normal annual luncheon. So thank you to that wonderful committee. They work so hard. Thanks, Giuseppe.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks very much, Kate, Suzanne. Thank you, Lesley. And we normally, it is our tradition to present a gift to the speaker, and we will certainly be organising that. So we'll probably send, and we'll get an address from you and send that to you. Thank you very much for agreeing to have the presentation downloaded to our YouTube site, and that's where people will be able to view it or send information to the friends and other supporters who haven't been able to attend today. Thank you very much. You may all now depart quietly.